Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to discuss my experience reading every single work of literature featured on the 90s PBS Kids TV show, Wishbone. Back in 2019, I started a series here on my channel going through all of the Wishbone episodes. What I did was read a work of literature that the Wishbone series adapted, and then I would watch the episode, or in the case of a lot of the episodes, I would rewatch the episode, since I saw many of these episodes back when I was a kid. But I would read the work of literature, watch the episode, so that I could compare the two and I could see how good of a job they did in adapting that work of literature for the screen. It's taken me 5 years to do, but I have now looked at every single episode of Wishbone and the TV movie they made back in the 1990s, which also means that I've now read every single literary work that they highlighted in the show. And I say literary work versus book because they didn't just adapt books. Of course, they're most famous for adapting books, but they also covered short stories, plays, epic poems, myths, legends, folktales. They covered more famous works of literature to more obscure ones. They took on works from all different cultures and across eras. I mean, they covered a pretty wide swath of the literary canon, which is especially impressive considering they were only on the air for 2 seasons, and the second season was a short one. So I thought today I could talk about some of my takeaways at the end of this journey. After having read all those works of literature, watched all those episodes of Wishbone, I've definitely noticed things. I definitely have some takeaways about what they covered and how they did so, what I think made for a good episode of Wishbone versus just a so-so one. And also, I thought I could talk about whether or not they missed any good opportunities in their short time on the air. Let's start with the question, what made a good episode of Wishbone? In every installment of Wishbone, there were 2 different storylines going on in the same episode, and we bounced back and forth between them. One of the storylines took place in the then modern day, the 1990s. We followed a family living in Texas with their pet Jack Russell Terrier Wishbone, and then the second storyline was always that literary adaptation. In every single episode, there were links connecting those 2 storylines. It made sense that they were appearing in the same episode, but in the best episodes of Wishbone, the links between those 2 storylines were very strong and crystal clear. Also, in most good episodes of Wishbone, excluding the mystery episodes, there was normally a moral message that the writers pulled out of the work of literature they were working with in that specific episode, and the writers would then highlight that moral message in both of the 2 storylines so that the kids watching at home would come away with the message the writers were trying to convey. A successful episode of Wishbone adapted the work of literature in question in a way that captured the spirit of the work. They didn't necessarily need to include every single major plot point or be 100% faithful to the work of literature in question, but they needed to get close enough so that the viewer came away with an understanding of what that work was all about, what it had to offer, what it feels like to read it. That way, the viewer will come away primed and maybe even interested to go on and read it for themselves someday. And a great episode of Wishbone did all of those things while also keeping the audience engaged, keeping the 2 different storylines fun, and making us fall even more deeply in love with the recurring characters. While there are plenty of really good Wishbone episodes that get most of what I just mentioned correct, there are 2 that I think do all of that the best. Those are the ones that adapt Silas Marner by George Eliot and The Story of the Deathless Voice, which is a Native American folktale. Both of those are so faithful to the source material. They contain really great storytelling across both storylines. And it doesn't hurt that they both really tug on the heartstrings. I would say actually that most of the episodes of Wishbone that I covered for my series contain at least one of those elements that I just outlined, one of those elements of a good episode. Really good ones contain more than one element, and then you can build up to the great ones that I just mentioned. But oftentimes, one of those elements would be weaker than others. For instance, there were frequently episodes that were lopsided, where the literary adaptation was better than the real life storyline, or vice versa. For instance, in the Don Quixote episode, that literary adaptation, I think, is one of their best. It is one of the ones that I remember most clearly from childhood, where the real life storyline just couldn't compete. And then there would also be episodes of Wishbone where I feel like the source material was just a little bit overly ambitious, where the writers were never going to be able to be faithful to the source material because there was just too much to work with. So The Count of Monte Cristo, for instance, you have to admire them for the ambition to take on such a huge, intimidating novel and trying to make it understandable for kids. But in the case of that book and several others throughout the entire series, I think they bit off a little bit more than they could chew. There's actually only one episode of Wishbone that I would say is bad, and that's the one that adapts the imaginary invalid. And I say it's bad because it spreads some pretty dangerous messages. If I've read correctly, I actually think it was banned for that reason. In the episode, the kids basically disregarded what another kid said his allergies were. And you could see how that could be dangerous. Throughout my experience watching all of these episodes, something that I consistently noticed is that the acting is way better than it has any right to be. I mean, these actors in the show are mainly Texas-based actors where this show was filmed, so production was pulling in a lot of local talent, specifically from the theater scene down in Texas. And those are the actors who did a lot of the literary adaptation work, so you can see just how talented they are in those literary adaptations, and they are especially able to put their talents on display in those episodes in which the literary adaptation was actually a stage production, like in the case of the Shakespeare episodes, or the Inspector General episode, which is another one of my favorites because it is hilarious. But also the actors on the 90s storyline side, I mean, they killed it in every single episode, especially the kids, the core friend trio, Joe, Sam, and David. I mean, these are preteens, teenagers. I'm not exactly sure how old they were at the time of filming, but they are carrying these scenes like it's nothing. They are so natural, so believable. Even when the writers would sometimes give them material that seemed out of character for their character, you still believed them because they were those characters. They inhabited those characters. Throughout this series, the writers also seemed very dedicated to challenging their viewers, expanding their horizons. There are, of course, a lot of more typical, popular works of literature that you would expect to be included in a series like this. But there are a lot of more surprising picks as well. Things like The Time Machine, The Red Badge of Courage, Journey to the West, things that include a lot more mature themes or that sit outside of the Western canon. I mean, this was an American TV show that was made before streaming services, so it was made with American kids in mind. So because of that, there is a focus on American and British literature, but they also didn't limit themselves because it's an American TV show. They also never talked down to their viewers, and that makes it so that you can now go back and watch this series as a child or an adult because they don't dumb things down. They don't overly censor things. They trust their audience to be able to handle more mature themes and topics, although they're always presented in a very respectful way. As I mentioned before, a lot of big titles, big important works of literature in the Western canon that you would expect to be included are included. Things like Pride and Prejudice, Oliver Twist, The Three Musketeers, The Adventures of Robin Hood. But then there were some notable exclusions that I found pretty surprising, and I only realized that they were missing when I was reaching the end of this project. So books like The Grapes of Wrath, The Great Gatsby, any of the Bronte novels, Little Women, that is probably the one I found the most surprising because I think that book is very important to young people, young girls in particular. And I think that one was probably excluded because while the cast of Wishbone did have a good number of female characters, I don't think there would have been enough to carry that kind of adaptation and that kind of real life storyline that would have needed to go with it, which is disappointing. It's especially disappointing realizing that there are those types of omissions, though, after you sit down with a comprehensive list of all of the works of literature that Wishbone adapted over the years, and you realize how much repetition there is when it comes to famous authors. Like, I know there are several episodes of Wishbone that adapt Charles Dickens novels. There are 2 Jane Austen episodes, 2 Sherlock Holmes episodes, 3 Shakespeare adaptations, 2 Washington Irving, several of Robert Louis Stevenson, Jules Verne, and Mark Twain, of course. Like, that's a lot of repetition in a show that was this short. I'm just going to come out and say that there absolutely could have been a greater variety of authors represented. Even sitting here now, I can think of a few of those episodes by repeat authors that could have been axed, that could have been sacrificed in favor of an episode focusing on a lesser known author. I mean, do we need 3 Shakespeare adaptations, 2 Jane Austens, multiple Mark Twains? I don't personally think so. If the point is to introduce literature to kids, then wouldn't it be better to feature some lesser known authors, books that kids would have probably never even heard of otherwise, rather than feature ones that predominantly are going to be the types of books that kids will be required to read at some point in their academic career? All of this to say that while I love this show, I adored it as a kid, and I think I love it even more now that I've watched and basically studied every single episode. It's not a perfect show. It is remarkable, however, just how much they were able to achieve, given how quickly they had to slap these episodes together and how demanding every single episode was to make. Even the not great episodes, you just have to stand in awe of how dedicated this team was to making this show. I wish more than anything that the show could have gone on longer back in the 1990s. I mean, it would have been so incredible to see that core friend group going off to high school together, experiencing high school together, and then maybe the entire series could have concluded with them going off to college. But this show was so good so early on in its life. I feel like had it been able to continue, it would have just continued to grow. It would have come into its own. It would have mastered that formula of a good episode that I was talking about before. And I think had it been given more episodes, it would have brought even more incredible works of literature to people's attention. There's a reason why Wishbone is still so cherished to this day by all of us who loved it back when we were kids. It made us excited about books and reading, and it took the intimidation factor off of classic literature, because I think especially for a kid, a classic seems like something dusty and intimidating. It sits up on a shelf. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with you and your day-to-day life. When really, a lot of those classic works of literature are discussing evergreen human things that all of us will go on to experience. And so the writers did something really special. They took those stories and they reworked them into something that felt familiar to kids back in the 1990s. They took away the intimidation factor and made those classics feel like something kids could find themselves in. Wishbone also introduced kids and me as an adult to so many different works of literature. I read a ton of different works of literature that I would have never picked up otherwise if not for my coverage of this show. And the 2 that I liked the most, that actually surprised me the most, were The Black Arrow by Robert Louis Stevenson, and particularly The Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain. I think that's going to be one of my favorite novels of this year, and I don't think I ever would have touched it if not for Wishbone. So as a kid or as an adult, you can be introduced to new things by this show. I am so grateful for Wishbone. I'm so grateful that it exists. I am so grateful that I got it back when I was a kid. I used to love watching these episodes after school. But then now, as an adult, I have this whole new appreciation for it. It's given me this wonderful challenge over the past 5 years of actually going through and reading all these works of literature, then getting to rewatch the episodes and examine them in these videos, to get to share the experience with my community, fellow Wishbone lovers, getting to hear what Wishbone means to all of you. It has been just such a special thing that I've gotten to do. When I started this back in 2019, I had no idea what was in store. I had no idea where it was going to take me, how long it was going to take me. It always seemed kind of like this bottomless well of content. It seemed like I would never be finished. But now that I am, it's really sad. It's come to hold such a special place in my heart that I almost feel bereaved. Like it feels like a part of my identity here on my channel. It is so hard to think that I am going to have to say goodbye, but it's time to. But since it is over, the only thing I have left to say is thank you. If anyone who was involved in making Wishbone ever happens upon this video, thank you personally for being involved in a show that just left such a lasting mark on me as a kid and continues to enrich my life now as an adult reader. And thank you all so much for watching, for coming along on this journey with me, for getting excited about Wishbone, for sharing your Wishbone memories with me. It has meant so much to me. If you're coming to this project late and you've missed any of the What's the Story Wishbone videos, if you want to go back and see some, if you want to see them all, I will link the playlist containing all of my Wishbone videos down in the description box below and up in the cards. But since you can probably tell I'm having a hard time letting Wishbone go, please down in the comment section below, tell me your Wishbone memories. Do you have a favorite episode? Do you remember when you first saw Wishbone? Did you have a favorite character from Wishbone? Is there a specific work of literature that you read because of Wishbone? And do you have any hopes for that movie that they promised us? I want to talk about any or all of that down in the comments below. Please keep Wishbone alive for me. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.